Okay, let's get started. The Help Systems email security solutions allow you to protect your sensitive data from external threats such as ransomware and phishing, and to govern how that sensitive data is being shared to ensure that it's only shared with the correct people, both inside and outside of your organization. In this session, we're going to take a look at some email security best practices and how you can use the Help Systems email security solutions in order to help you address your email security concerns. Now, to reduce background noise, we do have you all on mute. However, please feel free to use the questions panel to ask any questions as we go through the session. I'll try and tick them off as we're running through, but we'll have a section at the end where I'll try and catch any questions that I've missed as I've been running through. After the session, if you have any further questions or if you'd like access to the recorded webinar, then please feel free to email info@helpsystems.com. Now, just a little bit of background about myself. My name's Nick Hogg. I'm one of the directors of technical training here at Help Systems. I joined Help Systems about 2 years ago with the ClearSwift acquisition, and I've been with ClearSwift now for over 16 years. And a lot of my time is actually spent helping our customers understand how they can best use our solutions to address their email security, their data security, and their compliance concerns. Typically, when we're talking to organizations about email security or data security, the concerns tend to fall into 3 areas. And the first of these is about stopping the bad stuff from coming into the organization. It's about stopping the malware, the ransomware, the spyware getting into the organization to steal your data or limit your ability to access your own data and your infrastructure. But they also have concerns about these increasingly sophisticated phishing attacks being used just to trick their employees into maybe sharing information, financial details, PII, PCI, or whatever outside of the organization. The second area is around the data loss prevention side of things. And some of the concerns there are obviously around the malicious insiders and wanting the controls in place to start to protect the organization from that kind of malicious insider threat. But a great volume of the concerns really are around the accidental data loss, because when you look at the data breaches that occur from within organizations, typically the majority of them aren't malicious. It's just people making mistakes. It's somebody clicking in the wrong name in Outlook autocomplete and then sending some sensitive business information or customer details to the wrong recipient. And then lastly, we've got that kind of overarching shadow of compliance that we all seem to have to work under these days. It's the GDPRs, it's the PCI and the HIPAAs and so on, which are putting more focus in terms of how we're storing, accessing and communicating and sharing sensitive information, PII and PCI. Now, typically, when we're talking to organizations about email security best practices and helping them define their email security policies, there's a number of steps we might run through, and part of it is actually just recognizing that this is a bit of a cyclical process. So organizations typically will have some kind of email security policy in place today, but actually the nature of the organization is changing quite frequently. New suppliers are coming on board, new customers are coming on board, new projects are being launched, and the nature of the threats that are out there are changing as well. So we'll drill down through each of these steps in more detail in this session, but at a high level, part of it is about understanding the data that the organization needs to protect, but also the data that the organization maybe needs to share with business partners and customers. And then it's looking at the current threat landscape today in terms of what risks are we concerned about coming into the organization over email? Is it the ransomware, the spyware, the phishing risks? Are we concerned about the data loss and the types of data loss that we need to be guarding against going out of the organization? And once you've got that feeling for what the sensitive information is and the risks that you're currently facing and might likely come in the future, then that's where you can start to put in place the email security policies. And that's both the ones that you will share with the employees, but also it's the policies that you're actually enforcing within your email infrastructure. One of the risks I think a lot of organizations are concerned around is with closing that 0-day window, because increasingly we're seeing these very sophisticated malware attacks, ransomware, spyware attacks being targeted at organizations with a view to disrupting their operations or stealing their sensitive information. And these attacks are maybe bypassing the more kind of traditional antivirus defenses. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can use multiple layers of protection, multiple mitigation techniques to start to reduce the risk from these types of threats. We do recognize that you have to share sensitive information outside of the organization. So we'll touch on the encryption side of things about how you can encrypt your email communications, but also how you might choose to leverage enterprise digital rights management to further secure the data once it's outside of the organization's traditional boundary. And then the last piece about being able to monitor the behavior, I think is hugely important, because that allows us to understand the data risks that we're currently seeing so that you can potentially go off and take additional steps where maybe one of your users needs additional training on how to spot phishing attacks or on how to handle sensitive data securely. But also part of this monitoring piece is the bit that gives you the visibility of maybe new projects, new systems, new business partners that have been brought into the organization where you maybe haven't been given the visibility of that as part of the IT team or the compliance or the security teams. So you can start to enable the legitimate communications, but do that securely without becoming a barrier to the legitimate business processes. So if we drill down now and start to look at each of these steps in turn, I think with identifying the information that needs to be protected within an organization, this often starts off sounding like a very simple task, but the more you scratch at it, the more layers you find within here. But I think it's a very valuable thing to do, because if we recognize that not all data is created equal, and if we can identify what our sensitive data is, then we can wrap the appropriate security controls around that without becoming a barrier to the more ordinary, legitimate business processes that are happening within the organization. Now, when we talk to organizations, there's often a recurring theme of, well, look, we train our employees on what the sensitive data is and how it should be handled, but they have concerns where they maybe feel that they don't have sufficient visibility within all of the data flows to confidently say that the organization's employees are actually following the processes. So this visibility and this confidence that you can see everything within your data flows, I think is hugely important when you're looking at putting the solutions and the policies in place. Now, in terms of the types of sensitive data, it will vary depending on the organizations, but typically it might be the things that fall under the compliance legislation like the PII and the PCI. But we've all got our corporate financial information that shouldn't be freely shared within the business or outside of the organization, talk of mergers and acquisitions activity, all these kind of things. So there's definitely value in protecting that kind of information there. And increasingly the kind of manufacturing organizations we deal with, pharmaceuticals and so on, they are recognizing the value that's tied up within their product designs and their intellectual property, and that they're increasingly becoming targets for this kind of IP theft from outside of the organization. And then a significant number of our customers are kind of government and defense organizations who are kind of quite well used to working with the classification levels and the restricted access to certain pieces of information. And as I said, this is kind of an ongoing process. So you can take a snapshot in time today of what your sensitive data is, but what we find with organizations when we go in to do policy health checks, maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line from when they've implemented a solution, is actually the policy that they were running 5 years ago that made absolute sense for the business doesn't really make a lot of sense just now, because new suppliers have come on board, new customers, new processes have come in there. So going back to that visibility piece, with the email security solutions, it's important to choose those that will give you the kind of visibility of these new data flows that are maybe creeping into the organization, so you can quickly tweak the policies and stay in line with what the organization needs you to do today. In terms of the help system solutions, one of the real pieces of value that we bring to customers, even during the kind of discovery, the proof of concept, the proof of value phase, is this discovery piece, because we can sit in those communication flows and we can start to look for those data risks that you maybe weren't aware of, or we can look for those threats coming into the organization that you maybe weren't aware of as well. You know, the phishing messages that are making it through to the users' mailboxes. I think with the discovery piece, a very good example came from one of the financial organizations we dealt with recently, where they told us that they wouldn't expect to see any PII data being sent through the corporate infrastructure, through the email infrastructure, because they had other systems to handle that kind of sensitive data. But literally within 24 hours of putting the proof of value in, we could go back to them and say, look, are you aware that your HR department are asking for scans of passports from prospective employees that are getting emailed into the organization, and then they're simply getting forwarded out of the business to the external agency who do the background checks, the security checks, and at no point there is that PII data being encrypted or anything like that. And this is a kind of story that gets repeated time and time again. This discovery phase is hugely valuable because it can help you understand those data risks that you maybe weren't aware of, but also it can give you the confidence that maybe your employees are actually doing what they should be doing and they are following your policies to the letter. It's worth pointing out that we can work alongside any classification solutions you have in place. So if you're using the likes of Microsoft 365 with their classification markings within there, or some other kind of third-party solution, then our email security solutions can look for the visible markings, they can look for the metadata tags, and we can use that both in the monitoring phase to give you visibility of what's happening today with that kind of sensitivity of data. And then you can use that going forward to start to enforce the blocking policies or the encryption rules based upon those classification tags. And our gateways can obviously, alongside the monitoring piece, they can obviously stop and block things. What some of our customers find quite useful is the redaction and the sanitization technology, which I'll come into later on. But even during the discovery phase, sometimes you might say, well, we absolutely, here's 5 pieces of data that should never leave the organization as a starting point. And you can be much more proactive during the discovery phase because you can potentially say, well, look, there's a PDF attached to an email leaving the organization. Within Appendix D of that PDF, there's something that looks like a social security number or a Medicare number. Rather than blocking that whole communication, let's just go in there and redact that out and then let the rest of the communication go on its way once the data risk's been removed. And that ability to kind of remove the threat but deliver the traffic has proven to be kind of quite useful to organizations because it gives them a way of being a little bit more proactive when they're still kind of gathering information, but they do know that there's certain risks should absolutely not be leaving the business. The sanitization piece, again, can be quite useful up front because that gives you the ability to deal with some of these zero-day threats that we'll go into later on, where maybe you're stripping out active content like JavaScript, VB script, and macros that's coming into the business in Office documents and PDF files, where you're concerned that that might be the vector for ransomware or malware to get into the organization, but you're delivering the data through, and that gives you the ability to, deal with those threats, but in a very non-invasive way, because in the majority of cases, the end users get out of the sanitized file what they need because they need the data. They don't care about the JavaScript and so on. And then lastly, we've got the encryption piece that we'll dig into later on. But again, even during the early days for some of our customers' deployments, they choose to enable encryption for certain communication channels, or if we find certain pieces of sensitive data, it's something leaving the organization with healthcare data in it, we're automatically going to encrypt that regardless of where it's going, because that needs to be secured based upon some of the local compliance legislation. Now, I did mention in the previous slide that we can work alongside the multitude of kind of classification solutions that are out there. It's worth flagging that within the larger kind of help systems data security suite, which is where our email security solutions fit, we do have our own classification solutions, the Titus and the Bolton James solutions. And what we sometimes find when we're talking to organizations who are maybe using Microsoft 365 and they're using the sensitivity markings within there, these customers are finding that just having one sensitivity value associated with a file isn't enough for them, because actually just defining something as confidential doesn't give them enough nuance in the policy. So that's where they would typically look to use something like Titus or Bold and James, because that can allow you to associate multiple values with a file. So it's not just a confidential file, but it's a confidential file that relates to this customer and this project, and it contains this type of information, and the retention period in that is for X period of time. And those multiple values can be used within the email security solutions to allow you to deploy those more nuanced policies where you're enabling the appropriate communication of this sensitive information. You're maybe triggering the automatic encryption rules, but at the same time, you're not becoming an unnecessary barrier to the legitimate communications that are happening. In terms of being clear about the danger, I think the malware, the spyware, the ransomware side of things quite justifiably gets a lot of focus for organizations, because the concern about getting ransomware into your organization and suddenly removing your employees' ability to access the network for days or weeks at a time can be quite significant, or getting the spyware in there that's being able to steal your data, and that leads to the data breach or the compliance breach. But actually, when you start to look at phishing and business email compromise, I think we need to be concerned about those as well, because that humble phishing email can still lead to quite a significant number of data breaches and compliance breaches. I think there was a Verizon report from 2020 that said about 96% of social engineering attacks used email as the first point of contact with to get that kind of foothold into the organization. So it's important we guard against those increasingly sophisticated risk. Alongside of that, I think we have to assume that at some point, one of our employees might fall for a phishing email, or they might make that mistake where they send the wrong file, or they click on Outlook autocomplete and click in the wrong name there. So we should put in place the outbound policies to look for the intellectual property, the customer details, the PCI data, and so on, to guard against those data loss events and compliance breaches. That unwanted data acquisition bullet point is kind of quite an interesting one, because it's something that comes up increasingly with organizations we deal with, where actually they're looking to limit the volume of data that they're receiving and their risk footprint. So if you think about it in terms of compliance legislation, should one of my employees in customer services or in finance or whatever be able to receive something from one of our customers that contains PCI data or PII data? And what a lot of organizations are choosing to do at that point is maybe use things like data redaction to start to remove the pieces of data that this employee has no business seeing, because their job role doesn't require access to it. But at the same time, you can deliver the rest of the email, the rest of the attachment to them, because maybe they need the customer details to raise an invoice against them or something like that. So that ability to start to restrict the inbound data that you don't want within your environment has proven to be kind of quite useful. And then when you start to look at the more kind of restricted environments like defence and government agencies, or if you're a defence contractor working with other defence contractors, we have lots of use cases where an organisation wants to make sure that one of their employees can't receive data of a classification value that's higher than their clearance level. So this kind of inbound set of controls can prove to be kind of quite useful to organizations. The unnecessary file types one sounds like a small one, but I think still today there's great value in either blocking dangerous file types coming into the organization, or in terms of the outbound side of things, looking at sensitive file types that you don't want to leave the business. So it could be that you're a manufacturing organization and you don't want AutoCAD files going out of the organization to certain recipients. You can obviously stop them there. Or with some of the financial organizations we deal with, they may have policies that say, this type of data, if it's going out of the organization to a customer as a PDF is okay, but if it's going out of the customer in an editable format like a Word document, then we would want to block that from leaving the organization. And then lastly, the objectionable content piece, I think, is kind of quite interesting, because that's the piece that typically the HR department care about. They're concerned about the duty of care to their employees to make sure that they're not receiving racist, sexist abuse within the workplace, either from another co-worker or from outside of the organization, or God forbid, they accidentally send something out of the organization to one of your customers that could be quite damaging there. So we can take all of these elements together, and once we understand the data that we need to protect and the risks that are out there for us, that's where we can start to build our email security policy. And I think with building email security policies, a lot of this is kind of pretty straightforward in terms of, making it accessible and communicating it to the employees. One thing I would say is when we build out our email security policies, I think it's always worth involving people who aren't necessarily from a technical background in IT or compliance, because if you can start to target the end users there and make sure that the wording and the language that's used within there is as unambiguous as possible, then that's where you can maybe protect yourselves from some of the end user getting something and maybe not really understanding what you want them to do in a certain situation. When you've got your policy pulled together and you're thinking about communicating that to the employees, I would encourage you to refresh their memory quite frequently. I've worked for a place for 16 years now. I'm sure I read an email security policy when I joined the organization. That was 16 years ago. I can barely remember last week sometimes. So we've got to be conscious that for people who don't work in IT and security and compliance, data protection, compliance protection, guarding against phishing and so on isn't always necessarily at the forefront of their mind. So think about how we can educate the employees as part of our overall data security strategy. What I would encourage you to do is look at this kind of little and often approach with education. Too many organizations I've dealt with have got this kind of one-off, yearly event of compliance training or security training. And it becomes this kind of big onerous task because it's going to take an hour or 2 hours to get through, and it really just becomes a tick box exercise. And with the best will in the world, can you confidently say that 11 months later, somebody's going to have remembered the training about dealing with phishing risks and so on? Probably not. So what I think kind of works quite well for a lot of organizations is breaking it down. Maybe choose one topic a month. And then look at how you can communicate that in a very quick and easy way to the employee. So maybe a short video, just about 2 or 3 minutes on the dangers of ransomware or phishing or whatever. Send that out. It's a small investment in time, and you can follow that up with drop-in sessions where they can maybe drop into a webinar and ask you some questions about that if they need a little bit more information, or you're giving them a very clear point of contact to go to with any questions within there. What I think also works quite well in a kind of corporate setting is don't just frame it in terms of protecting the corporate's data and infrastructure and so on. Actually, for a lot of things like phishing, ransomware, data loss, compliance and so on, you can put that in a context that will be relevant to them, because how does this also apply to them in their kind of home settings? How can they apply the same practices when they're looking to protect themselves and their family online as well? And that maybe makes the uptake of the training a little bit better, but also it makes the retention of that side of things a little bit better as well. Now, when we're talking about closing the 0-day window, I think it's worth recognizing that increasingly a lot of the spyware and ransomware attacks are becoming much more sophisticated. It's that kind of constant arms race against the attackers. So what we really should be looking to do is using a layered defense to mitigate the risks. And it's not just different types of detection, but it's also to different types of remediation. And I'll talk about Microsoft 365 in a second, but for a lot of the organizations we deal with, they've moved to Microsoft 365, or they're part of the way through the migration. But actually the reason they're deploying our solutions is because they recognize that actually they need additional layers of detection and mitigation to deal with these kind of 0-day threats coming into the organization. And when you're looking at the threats, something as simple as anti-spam is still very valuable, because just filtering out a lot of the known senders of malware and ransomware and spam can be hugely beneficial in terms of reducing your footprint there. But we do have to be conscious that the phishing attacks are getting more and more sophisticated. It's people masquerading as a business partner or as an executive. So we need to look at those mechanisms that can give us additional layers of protection there. Maybe the things that are making it through to the end user's mailbox today, how can we plug in at that level and maybe use artificial intelligence, machine learning to start to look at some of the wider traffic patterns that are out there in the wild to guard against these new and emergent phishing attacks. The deep content inspection piece, I think, is kind of quite relevant because we need to make sure that our email security solutions are able to analyze the traffic to the nth degree. So the kind of common thing where you might see somebody renaming a script file like PowerShell to .pdf and then sticking that inside a zip file in the hope that that might be enough to get it into the organization past a more kind of superficial email security defense. We need to mitigate against that risk. So we need something that will take that traffic, the email, the attachments to pieces to the nth degree, so you can confidently say that when your policy has been put in place, it will be enforced within there. The kind of traditional antivirus is still kind of quite useful to us because while that might not help with the kind of zero-day attack, it still filters out a huge volume of the known attacks that are out there. And a significant portion of those are using known pieces of malware and ransomware. But we do need to recognize that traditional antivirus isn't enough, because when you look at the successful ransomware and spyware attacks against organizations, somewhere between roughly about a quarter and a half of those are bypassing the traditional antivirus defenses. So that's where we need to look at supplementing those with the likes of sandboxing and active content sanitization and URL sanitization to deal with these kind of zero-day risks. And I'll drill into those in a second to explain how we can use those to good effect. It's worth pointing out that for a lot of the organizations we deal with, they're kind of concerned in two areas. They're maybe looking for something that sits at the boundary of the organization, in front of your mail infrastructure, in front of your existing email security defenses today, to complement those, to give you additional layers of protection. And as I said, with the likes of Microsoft 365, we've got a lot of customers who've migrated across there, but they recognize that there's maybe some gaps in terms of dealing with some of these zero-day risks coming into the organization. So they're looking for additional layers of protection that our secure email gateway can give them at the boundary. But they're maybe also recognizing that on the outbound side of things, they need additional detection mechanisms for data loss prevention and compliance. So that may be scan of a medical record that could quite happily sail through Microsoft 365 and not get picked up because the medical information is within a scanned image, would get picked up by our email gateway on the outbound. And it's not just about extending the detection capabilities, it's also about giving you additional mitigation techniques, so the likes of the redaction and the sanitization that I touched on earlier. And we need to not just look at the inbound and the outbound traffic, but we need to be concerned about the internal traffic as well. So again, with the likes of something like Microsoft 365 here, but equally we could be doing this with on-premise infrastructure, we can set up the kind of rules that would send the internal traffic through the email gateway, so that you can start to enforce these internal policies to stop the malware and the ransomware bouncing around inside the organization, or to enforce that duty of care, or to make sure that maybe some sensitive data that shouldn't be freely shared with all of the employees doesn't accidentally get emailed to somebody who shouldn't be able to see the latest mergers and acquisitions activity or notices of redundancy or something like that. Now, in terms of combating some of these inbound risks with our email gateway, we've got a choice of 3 antivirus solutions that can run there to pick up these known threats coming into the organization. What we typically recommend to customers is to run 2 of the antivirus solutions side by side, because in our testing we see somewhere between a 5% and a 15% uplift in the detection rates when you're running dual AV versus a single AV. And that's really just because one day one of the antivirus vendors might be slightly ahead of the others in terms of getting the signature updates out, and then the next day would be a different antivirus vendor. But we do have to recognize that just traditional antivirus on its own isn't going to be enough to deal with some of these zero-day threats. So that's where our sandboxing service comes into play, because even if a file coming into the organization, maybe a Microsoft Office document or an executable file or something like that, maybe if that doesn't trigger as being a known piece of malware, we still want to be a little bit cautious about that because it could bring a risk into the organization. So this is where we can pass that across to our sandboxing service, which will essentially detonate, which is kind of quite a fancy way of just saying it will interact with the file in a Windows environment to try and see what's going to happen if I open this file up and I start to interact with it and click on links and so on. That can give you that additional layer of confidence that the messages and the files coming into the organization aren't going to bring one of these zero-day risks with them. It's worth pointing out that in terms of our licensing, we license the sandbox based upon the number of users within the organization rather than the number of detonations, because with detonations, that can sometimes be kind of quite hard to forecast, because how can you confidently say how many files you will pass to the sandboxing service in a year? So licensing it based upon the user count just gives you a very simple and easy to forecast spending for the year of, if we want to take sandboxing, this is how much it's going to cost us based upon our number of users. With the sandbox, we're going to pass across executable file types, Microsoft Office, PDF files, BAT files, and so on to the sandbox. Now, you can choose which of the cloud deployments you want to use based upon your region and your kind of data sovereignty requirements there. It's worth pointing out that the files are passed across to the sandbox via HTTPS. We'll detonate, we'll interact with the file, and then if we determine that that file is clean, we'll throw it away and send the result back to the gateway for processing. If we determine that the file is potentially malicious, again, we'll throw that file away and we'll only store a fingerprint of the file in the sandboxing service. So we don't retain any of the data itself on the sandbox there. You get these kind of nice kind of detailed reports, which can kind of be used when you want to drill into things and explain to the end user why that file wasn't allowed into the organization, because it's potentially going to do something malicious to us. And I think that sandboxing service gives us a good level of confidence when it comes to allowing data into the organization when we're concerned about some of these zero-day risks. But you can also complement that with another layer of defense, which is the active content sanitization. With the active content sanitization, we recognize a lot of the attacks that are happening are coming into the organization disguised as a common Office file format. So maybe a PDF that's going into somebody in the finance team that's made to look like a purchase order, and maybe somebody's masquerading as one of your customers or a business partner. But actually, within that PDF, there's some JavaScript, and as soon as the user opens the file up, it will automatically install the ransomware, the spyware into the organization, kind of unbeknownst to the user. Now, the active content sanitization is a very simple, straightforward, and easy win for you, because you can put that in place and you can simply just say, if something's coming into the organization and there's active content there, we'll strip all of the active content out, we'll deliver the sanitized version with all the data intact through to the end user, and we'll retain a copy of the file on the gateway for kind of investigatory purposes, or if it turns out that the recipient needs to have the original file in the first place. We've had this functionality for about 10 years now, and it can dramatically cut down the pain that you would see within the organization when you're coming to deal with these risks, because in the majority of cases, I would say about 80 or 90% of the cases where you sanitize the active content out, the end users don't put a follow-on call into the help desk because they don't care. They don't miss the active content because they've got enough out of that file to do their job. In the event where maybe there's been a false positive, maybe it's an Excel spreadsheet that's come in from the financial auditor and there's some macros in there that we stripped out, then when that person puts the call into the help desk, they're already much more educated about what they're looking for here, and they've got the justification for releasing the message. So what you see in practice is that can reduce the time to close some of these calls off as well. And then you can choose to deliver the unsanitized version of the file into the organization. But actually, again, this is where the sandboxing can come in useful, because rather than just trusting it's coming from a trusted source, actually we could pass that back through the sandbox to see if any kind of new attacks have come to light since we last processed it, to see if potentially there's a match within there for a risk within that Excel spreadsheet. So that active content sanitization gives you another layer of protection when you're looking to put in place this kind of multi-layered defense to deal with these internal threats. And then lastly, for the email gateway side of things, we've got the URL sanitization, because if we see a URL in the message body or if in the subject line or within an attachment, because increasingly the attacks are coming in with malicious URLs embedded within the attachments, we can do a real-time lookup to check against our variety of threat feeds to see if that URL is pointing to a known malware or ransomware site. And you could block or you could strip the URL out and deliver the sanitized data through to the end user. Or, as some of our customers choose, you could be a little bit stricter about it and actually just choose to sanitize all incoming URLs apart from maybe a few whitelisted ones, and then keep copies of the sanitized message and documents in the event that the user needs the original thing there. And again, that can really start to deal with some of these inbound phishing and malware threats, where maybe the message itself looks pretty benign and harmless, but actually it's the link that could be the dangerous thing for the end user when they click on that. To complement the email solutions, we also have our Agari solution, because it could be that you're using Microsoft 365 for your kind of boundary email security. It could be you're using another vendor's email security gateway to give yourself that boundary defense there. But what you're finding is actually that there's a significant volume of spam or phishing messages making it into the user's mailbox. And this is where our Agari solution comes into play, and it has the phishing defense and the phishing response components. The Agari solution is essentially a cloud-based solution that takes in a huge volume of threat feeds. It can build up some very intelligent pictures of threat patterns based upon all the volume of our customers' details that we're processing. And it's got a lot of machine learning and AI built in there, so that it can actually start to build up some real intelligence about your legitimate business traffic. And this really can start to combat those pieces of potentially spam or phishing mail that's making it through to your end users' mailboxes past the other defenses that you have in place today. And it's there to really start to look for these very tricky to find things, where it's maybe somebody who's trying to masquerade as one of your business partners, and they've just brought up a new domain that's kind of quite similar to one of your business partner domains, or they're trying to masquerade as a CEO or something like that. We can look for these kind of hard to find account takeover attacks, these kind of masquerading attacks, and we can choose to delete these messages as soon as they hit the user's mailbox, or move them to a quarantine area. The phishing response piece is your more kind of reactive bit, where with the phishing defense, that's where you're putting the rules in place, that's where the machine learning is tweaking the policy to stop the risks as soon as it hits the user's mailbox. With the phishing response, that gives you the ability to investigate something that one of your users has reported to you. So maybe one of your users says, hey, look, I've got this message, it kind of looks like it's from Microsoft, but it looks a little bit dodgy. Can I trust it? And it gives you ability to drill in there, look at the message, look at the reputation associated with the sending source, look at the results of sandboxing scans against any attachments or URLs, and use that as a judgment call to say, you know what, this is perfectly fine, it looks legitimate, crack on and use this message, or yeah, this is a phishing message. And not just rip it out of the user's mailbox, but actually search across your whole organization's mail estate and remove maybe the hundreds of copies of that message and similar ones from all of the mailboxes of your users before somebody gets the chance to click on something within there. Now, with the Agari component, as I mentioned, that is a cloud-based component that can look at the threat feeds, the volume of traffic that we process for all of our customers, and the machine learning can start to learn what is your legitimate business traffic. Regardless of whether you're in the cloud, in the likes of Office 365 or G Suite, or if you're on premise with Exchange or so on, we can deploy a sensor which essentially just plugs into your mail infrastructure. It can pass the data we need to the Agari cloud to build up that detailed policy model, and any actions you take will be passed back to the sensor, and we can use that to strip the messages that cause the risks to the users out of the mailboxes. And one of the real powers of the Agari solution is alongside the kind of machine learning that's happening in the background is, as an admin, you can very quickly build up a picture for what your legitimate traffic is, but also what the riskier pieces of traffic are that might need a little bit of more investigation. So typically the stuff in the top right-hand corner is what we see as good traffic from your business partners, from your customers, from reliable sources like AWS or whatever that's out there. But at the same time, you can start to identify outliers where maybe in the left-hand side, we're looking at the spam messages, the display name abuse. In the bottom right-hand corner, that's where we're starting to look at the domain spoofs, the things that maybe you might want to drill into and say, yep, this definitely looks a little bit suspicious. Let's tweak the policy to make sure that this doesn't get into the user's mailboxes and strip out anything that's already made it through to a user's mailbox at this point of view. So those two components, the secure email gateway and the Agari solution, give you the ability to deal with those inbound risks. But at the same time, I think it's good practice to have the policies in place to look at the outbound data risks and compliance risks. And alongside the more kind of standard stop and block and lexical scanning that our email gateway does, there's some areas where I think there's some real value. And one of these is around the optical character recognition, because increasingly we're finding that sensitive data is being sent into, around and out of organizations within the likes of scanned documents and imagery and so on. So it could be a scan of a legal contract or a patient record, or it could be a screenshot of a customer records. Just because it's within an image doesn't mean it's any less sensitive. So we've got the ability with scanned documents, with images, about 20 different file formats, including multiple layer formats like Photoshop file formats and so on, to essentially go in there, extract out the text, run that against the 48 different languages that we support, including the likes of Chinese and Japanese and so on, to extend your data loss prevention and your compliance policies to the scanned documents and the imagery as well. And that's proven hugely valuable to a lot of our customers. I touched on the data redaction piece earlier. I think this is kind of quite useful to you because it gives you a way of controlling your data risks and your compliance risks, but do it in a very non-disruptive way, because rather than blocking that message because we see the thing in there within the attachment that looks like the Medicare number in the Appendix D, we can just go in there and we can redact that out. And that data redaction can happen within the body of the message. It can happen within editable attachments like a Word document or a PDF file, but also alongside the OCR, you can do the data redaction within image formats like scanned documents and so on as well. So that gives you a very quick win when it comes to enforcing your DLP and compliance policies, where you're removing the data risk, but because you're allowing the rest of the communication to go on its way, you're maybe being much less disruptive about it, because typically the person on the far end doesn't need that one thing in Appendix D that looks like the Medicare number to do their job. But obviously, as with the sanitization, we've got the ability to keep copies of anything where we've done redaction. So in the event of the false positive, where somebody in HR is saying, actually, this is an employee record I need to send to an external lawyer because we're working on an industrial tribunal and they need the unredacted version, you can release that. And then maybe you can tweak the policy to make sure that the next time that goes, you've got an encrypted policy route to secure that data. It's also worth pointing out this works incoming as well. So if you want to limit that kind of unwanted data acquisition, again, the data redaction can be used to strip out, PCI and PII that's going to recipients within the organization who don't necessarily need access to that data, but they might need legitimate access to the rest of the communication coming into the business. The data redaction is there to deal with the kind of visible risks that maybe the users just don't appreciate shouldn't be shared with a coworker or with a business partner. With the document sanitization, that's more around the hidden risks. It's things like the metadata, which to me as an attacker is really useful if I can see who's created a document or who's reviewed a document, because that maybe allows me to spoof a message into the organization. into somebody who's previously reviewed a document to say, hey, remember this document you looked at? Why don't you take a look at version 2? I've made a few changes. But now I've put the malicious payload in there that will silently install the spyware in the organization when that user opens the file up. So we can strip out the metadata information to limit the information we're giving to the external attackers. But metadata risks can sometimes sound a little bit esoteric, I think. For a lot of the organizations we deal with, what they're concerned about is actually the version history, the change control information, the unaccepted changes, because it could be that that paragraph your user thought was deleted from the document actually lives somewhere in the background, and that could be damaging if somebody were to receive the document, go back through the version history and find that paragraph that contains information you don't want them to see. So the document sanitization gives you a very quick win because it just allows you to go in, strip out the metadata, strip out the unaccepted changes in the version history to make sure that what's leaving the organization is what the user actually thought was being sent out of the business. At some point, we do have to share, and increasingly so, sensitive information with business partners and customers and co-workers. And this is where we can use encryption to secure those communications. I think with encryption, it's important that we try and choose solutions that are as transparent and easy to use from the end user's perspective as possible. So we're not relying on them clicking buttons or remembering to do manual encryption processes, because whenever there's a manual process, you have the risk that a user, when they're a little bit busy and stressed and tired, might forget to follow that and then send something sensitive out of the business unencrypted. So let's look at how we can use automated encryption within our policies to take the decision out of the user's hands. But also let's look at having a range of options available to us to make sure that what's getting sent to the recipient is appropriate, because my mum is not going to know what to do with a PGP encrypted message. So if you sent her something that maybe went through an encryption portal that was much easier to use in terms of clicking a link, create an account, and access something that looks like a webmail client, that gives you the ability as an insurance provider, as a bank, as a healthcare provider to send her sensitive information that needs to be encrypted, but do it in a way where you're not reliant on her trying to get her head around PGP encryption. Just encrypting the messages in transit is a good practice, but we might also want to think about things like enterprise digital rights management, because that gives you the ability to extend the protection to the data once it's outside of the traditional boundary of the organization, or even internally. So as well as encrypting the file, we can wrap access control lists and permission lists around that file to ensure that if somebody receives it, they're able to open it and maybe they can view it, but they can't save it or edit it. But if they were to forward that on to a third party who isn't authorized, that third party simply will not be able to access that file. And that's a common requirement that we see when we're talking to the likes of, financial services, manufacturing, legal and pharmaceutical and so on. They want to have that kind of EDRM applied to the file to limit who's got the access to the file, even once it's outside of your control. Now, with our email security solutions, we've got a variety of encryption components available to you. We've got the transport layer security component where you can encrypt the communication channel between our email gateway and your mail infrastructure. Could be Microsoft 365, could be an on-premise, but also when we're sending and receiving messages with external parties. That TLS can be opportunistic, where we'll try and use it, but if we can't, because the sending or receiving mail client doesn't support it, then we'll simply send in the clear. But we can also run mandatory TLS endpoints there. So if you're a bank talking to another bank and it has to be over TLS, then you can absolutely enforce that TLS connection within there. But just encrypting the communication, it's a good first step, but we should also be looking at the encrypting the content of the communication as well. And that's where the portal-based option comes into play. Typically we see that used by financial services, by healthcare, by insurance, when you're talking to, it's the kind of business to consumer model where you want a very easy to use mechanism talking to the members of the public, but you need to send the data encrypted and secured. But also we've got the more kind of business to business model where we're using PGP, SMIME and password protected zip files. The important point to me here is we can set this up so it's all policy based. So the encryption will be triggered based upon routing, who it's coming from or who it's going to, or based upon the content of the message. We can see that this is leaving the organization, it contains healthcare information, and it's going to one of our customers. This needs to be routed through the encryption portal. Or we can see that's the same healthcare information, but it's going to a hospital or a business partner. Then we'll use the PGP or the SMIME endpoint that we set up there. So take the decision out of the user's hands, have it all happen entirely transparently from their point of view. We can do the content scanning at the email gateway level to make sure that nothing inappropriate is being sent to that recipient, and then we can automatically apply the encryption when this type of data is allowed to go to this recipient outside of the organization. I mentioned the DRM piece before. It's worth pointing out here that another component of our larger data security suite is our Vera DRM solution, which doesn't just apply the AES 256 encryption to the file, it also wraps access control lists around the file, so you can control who internally, but also who externally is able to access the file, and you can wrap permission sets around that as well. So I could share this file with one of my coworkers, Steve, but I'm only going to give him read access, so he's not able to edit the file or print the file or take a screenshot, copy and paste text out of that. The important thing here is with Vera is actually it's a real-time lookup when the user goes to access the file. So if you subsequently decide that you want to remove somebody's permission to access that file, it's a very quick, simple step for the document owner. And then even if somebody could access that file yesterday, they will no longer be able to open the file and view the content of that. And then the last piece here is the monitoring piece. And I think that the monitoring piece is kind of quite important to us because that gives us the ability to not just investigate the existing threats that we're maybe stopping with the gateway or with the Agari solution, because that might allow us to drill in and understand that maybe some of our users need a little bit more targeted training about combating phishing risks or about handling sensitive data. It also allows us to start to identify those instances where maybe we need to make a tweak to the policy to align ourselves a little bit better with what the organization needs us to do today. And regardless of whether it's the email gateway or the Agari solution, the policies have been designed to be as easy to manage as possible and as granular as possible. So you can really build a policy that exactly meets your organization's requirements to secure the important stuff, but also not to become this overly restrictive barrier to the legitimate communications. And you can drill into the quarantine messages, into the potential reported spam messages and phishing messages to really understand what threats have been found and use that information to maybe dictate your policy and your training requirements going forward. And of course, we can integrate with the third-party CM solutions like the Splunks and the ArcSites if you want that kind of centralized repository for compliance violations or data loss events and so on within there. That is a ridiculously high-level overview of what the Help Systems email security solutions can do for you. But I think when we're approaching our policy definitions with our customers, we typically would go through these kind of steps of understanding what types of data the organization needs to protect, understanding the areas where there's maybe unknowns. We don't even know if we've got a risk around this type of data being sent into and out of the organization. So let's go off and do some discovery to find out about that. Be conscious of the kind of the current dangers, but also what's potentially coming at us down the pike, so that we can use that to put in place the policies that are effective and appropriate for the organization. And where we're maybe looking to deal with some of the zero-day threats coming to the organization, with the likes of the sandboxing and the anti-phishing defenses and the active content sanitization to complement the more kind of traditional antivirus defenses. Look at how we can use encryption to secure legitimate communications going out of the organization, and then how do we get the visibility within there to give us that kind of insight into existing policy violations, but also in terms of how we need to evolve the policy to align it with the business requirements. And we've kind of been through the email security solutions there. It's worth just pointing out here that regardless of where you're deployed, if you're on premise, if you're in the cloud, or if you're in that kind of hybrid where you've got some on-premise Exchange and you've got a little bit of Office 365, we can deploy alongside you to deal with all of these kind of deployment models within there. Cool. So I'm just going to step across to the questions here and go through the ones I maybe haven't picked up as we go through. So the one about also optical character recognition, yeah, absolutely. So we can we can pick up multiple language formats within scanned documents. So if you're concerned about files that are being something that's been scanned in a kind of scanner printer and has been emailed across to one of your employees as a PDF attachment, then yeah, you can use the OCR to stop that from being forwarded out of the organization if we were to find sensitive data within there. There's a question about the encryption side of things in terms of can we trigger the encryption based upon the presence of keywords or tokens or something like that. The answer is absolutely yes. So we could look for sensitive words, we could look for sensitive tokens like any of the hundreds of PII and PCI tokens that might pose a risk there. We can also look for classification tags. So again, if you're using Microsoft 365 or Titus or Vera, to put the visible markings or the metadata tags into a file or into the X header of an email, we can use that within our email gateway to trigger the appropriate encryption model based upon the policy that you've got in place within there. There's a question about the document sanitization piece. That's the piece that strips out the metadata, but also the version history and the change control information. Essentially the question is, well, what if you've got a legal team who actually use track changes and document comments when they're working on things? It's just a content rule, and as I said, the policy is very granular. So if you have certain teams, certain individuals where you want to exempt them from some of the policies, then it's just a question of building a policy route for them where that rule is maybe not applied. So if we can see it's going from your legal team to your external lawyers or to a third party's lawyers, you can choose to allow the unaccepted changes and the document comments to remain, and then that will leave the organization as well. There's a question here about, does ClearSwift offer consultancy to help organizations run a project like this to improve email security? Absolutely. So as part of the discovery process with our sales engineers, they will inevitably help to start to steer you in the right direction in terms of some of the risks to consider. And as part of that kind of discovery phase, when you're doing a proof of value, proof of concept, that will help to uncover maybe some of the risks that your organization wasn't aware of. We have a very well-established consultancy service who can pick it up when you move to purchasing the solution and looking to deploy it, who can help you at every stage. They can help you with the deployment considerations, with scoping out your email security policies. Equally, as I mentioned earlier, we have our health check services where we can go back into an existing customer and maybe reevaluate the policy that they have in place today, because as I said, the policy that you put in place 5 years ago may not be suitable or best aligned to what the organization needs to do today. So we can make recommendations about best practice in terms of dealing with some of the external threats. We can help you understand where maybe there's additional things you can do around your data protection, your compliance risks within there. And there's a question, will the recording for the meeting be available after this? Then yeah, absolutely. I believe we typically will email you a link to the recording afterwards automatically, but I will double check with marketing, and if not, I've got your name here and I will be able to send that across to you. And that is all the questions that have come in so far. So if you would like access to the recording after this, or if you have any further questions that you would like to ask, or if you would like to maybe arrange a demonstration with one of our sales engineers to drill into things in a little bit more depth and to see specifically how this can assist your organization, then please feel free to drop an email through to info@helpsystems.com and we'll be able to pick that up and route that across to the most appropriate person for you. And with that, I will thank you very much for your time. And actually, I can see a last second questions come in here. 2 seconds. Yeah, so it's a question more around the Agari side of things. Yeah, so essentially we use a sensor, regardless of where you're on premise or in the cloud, we use a sensor which allows us to get access to your mailbox and to your users' mailboxes, and that sensor can absolutely be deployed into Office 365 instances, and we can run across your entire Office 365 estate to give you that kind of insight into the mail flow and start to give you that additional level of protection. And as you say here, you're kind of concerned about the phishing messages that are making it through to your users' mailboxes in that instance. So with that, I will thank you very much for your time. And one of our fine colleagues in marketing has just messaged me to say you will automatically get an email of the recording. So with that, thank you. And as you've seen, the Help Systems email security solutions allow you to protect your sensitive data from external threats, such as ransomware and phishing, and also to govern how that sensitive data has been shared to ensure that it's only shared with the correct people, both inside and outside of your organization. With that, I will thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.